There are several keyframe assistants in After Effects that help you do boring, repetitive tasks. We're going to have a look at some of those here in the Keyframe Assistants AEP, which you can find in the Fine-Tuning Animation folder. And I've got 04 Drink, Drink, Drink composition open. And this is one we worked on earlier. If we preview it, we'll see we've got a little bit of animation happening at the beginning here of the comp. So what I'm going to do is just trim that to the 5-second mark so we don't keep previewing the whole animation. And to do that, I can either drag in my work area marker, or I can hit the N key on the keyboard. N will trim the end of the work area to the time marker. B will trim the beginning of the work area to the time marker. And if we have a look at that again, on loop, you'll notice a couple of things are wrong. First of all, the logo scales out instead of in. That's probably the easiest thing to fix. I'm going to select those keyframes and I can select scale and rotation just by dragging a marquee selection around them. I'm going to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and this is where all the keyframe assistants live. And the one that I'm going to choose is Time Reverse Keyframes. And that's just going to very quickly reverse my selected keyframes so that the animation scales up instead of down. That's a really handy one. Another handy one are the Easy Ease ones, and we've had a look at Easy Ease by right-clicking, but you can also access it through the Keyframe Assistant menu, because Easy Eases are keyframe assistants. Now you can multiple select keyframes for Easy Eases, so let's select these two, and then let's hold down Shift and select the first one in this group and the first one in that group. And we can go to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease Out, because we're easing the motion on the way out of the keyframe. Keyboard shortcut for that, by the way, is Command-Shift F9 or Control-Shift F9 on Windows. And we now get an eased motion going out from the keyframe. We can also select the second groups of keyframes. Whoops. Now, I made the mistake of holding down the Command key instead of the Shift key there. And I've actually converted my keyframe to Auto Bezier keyframe. So I'm just going to take a minute just to undo that interpolation change. Just shows that you have to keep your eyes on what you're doing and keep noticing what's happening in terms of icons changing. And then we're going to go to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In. And if we preview that, you'll see very quickly that we have a much smoother motion coming into the keyframe. Okay, so we've improved the animation, but really, if we want to make that logo a little bit better, it's a good idea to do what's called pushing past the pose. Now, at the moment, I've got all three layers selected, so I need to make sure to deselect and then select. Now, you can also deselect by using a menu item here, Deselect All, or Command-Shift-A, and that's one you want to try and remember. Control-Shift-A if you're on Windows. So to push past the pose, first of all, we move to the keyframes. So we'll hit the K key on the keyboard to jump to the second group of keyframes. And then we want to move back a couple of frames. You can either do that by hitting the previous frame button twice, or you can use the up and down, page up and down keys on the keyboard. So page up and page down will allow you to move backwards and forwards by one frame. And what we're going to do is we're just going to scale it up to 120. So it scales beyond 100% and gives us a nice little bounce before it comes to rest. And you'll see what happens if we zoom into the timeline by hitting the plus key on the keyboard. You'll see it's created a little easy eased keyframe for us. Because the in and out keyframes were already eased, it will automatically ease that. And if we have a look, we'll see we get a little bounce there. Okay, so just before it comes down to rest, it has a little bounce. Now, of course, you can exaggerate that. You can go into the graph editor and exaggerate that even more. So what other keyframe assistants are useful? Well, there's a few keyframe assistants. The first one that I want to show you is sequence layers. If you open 01 Traditional Animation, I have these layers here of drawings that I've done of this dog walking. And if we just have a look at those one by soloing them, you can see the different layers there. So what I want to do is play them in sequence. So I'm going to select them in the order that I want them to appear. and then go up to the Animation menu, Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. You'll notice how the others are greyed out. This is the only one that's available when you have multiple layers selected. So we choose Sequence Layers. We're not going to overlap them. We're just going to say place them one after the other in the timeline, but you can put a cross dissolve in there if you want to. Click OK, and there we have them sequencing perfectly in the timeline. So another handy little keyframe assistant. Funnily enough, this one doesn't help with keyframes unless you put your crossfade in. That's why it's in Keyframe Assistance, because it will keyframe a fade of opacity for you automatically. Okay, the final one we want to look at is exponential scale. Bread and butter job for motion graphic artists is to create pans and zooms around images, and you'll see I've got one here where I'm animating anchor point and scale to zoom into this image. Now you'll notice that the speed appears to change. Okay, it seems to zoom in faster at the beginning and kind of gradually slow down towards the end. And if I was to reverse those, so I'll select anchor point and scale keyframes by shift-clicking both the names here, and then going to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. If we have a look at it zooming out, you can really see the speed starting to change there. And that's because scale changes linearly, so it will either appear to accelerate or decelerate. And that's because the perceived difference between 0 and 10% is a big change. It's like going from 0 to 10% is like 100% change, if you like. Whereas going from 90% to 100% is only like 10% change. So we perceive the change between 90 and 100 to be different from the change between 0 and 10. So to overcome that problem, if you're doing a scale change and you notice it either accelerating or decelerating, what you want to do is go to the Animation menu, choose Keyframe Assistant, Exponential Scale. And that will exponentially build the scale for you so that you get a much smoother zoom out. And if we look at that in real time, you notice we've got a completely even speed now as we zoom out. And again, if we want to reverse it to zoom in, we can do exactly the same again, Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes, and as if by magic, we now have an even speeded zoom in. So if you find you're getting frustrated with things speeding up or slowing down as you're zooming, just use exponential scale. Now if we have a look at how that looks in the graph editor, select the property, click on Graph Editor button, it puts a slight curve in there to build the scale exponentially rather than linearly. So that's a few keyframe assistants that I find really useful. There are also other things like the smoother and the wiggler. We had a look at the smoother when we used the motion sketch panel. The wiggler is extremely useful if you just want to put a slight wobble into the camera, for example. So I could maybe bring up my rotation value to make it look as if the camera is wobbling. And I could set a keyframe at the beginning. And I do that by clicking on the stopwatch. That will add my first keyframe. And then if I want to add an identical keyframe at the end, I actually click on this button to add or remove a keyframe at the current time. Okay, once I've got the two keyframes, if I select them both by clicking on the word rotation, I can then apply the wiggler. Now I'm going to say apply it to a temporal graph, so you can choose spatial if you have a position property or anchor point property. We're going to say keep it a smooth motion, and how many times do we want it to wobble per second? I would say maybe once per second. And we're only going to wobble it by maybe 1 or 2 degrees, so let's leave it on 1. I click apply, and I get a keyframe each second, giving me a slightly random rotation value. So if I want to add some randomness to the rotation value or any other value, I can use the wiggler palette. And that's another kind of keyframe assistant.